Hello everyone. Today we will be discussing the First World War with a particular focus on its global aspects. No 15-minute lecture could ever do justice to the unbelievable scale and destruction of the war, so instead we will focus on a number of particular locations and the events that occurred there. Let us begin in Ireland. Irish issues dominated British politics between 1910 and 1914, when a constitutional crisis resulted from efforts to introduce an Irish Parliament, so-called Home Rule. Under Home Rule, Ireland would still be in the British Empire and would retain the king as its ruler, yet the promise of an Irish Parliament, dominated by Catholics, was intolerable for Irish Protestants, known as Unionists, for their support of a continued union with Great Britain. The Unionists, who parroted the quip that Home Rule was Rome Rule, even founded their own paramilitary organisation, the Ulster Defence Volunteers, in 1913. To counter the UVF, the so-called Irish Volunteers, a Catholic and nationalist organisation, was founded in Dublin. Ireland seemed on the verge of a war of its own when, to everyone's shock, the UK joined the war against Germany. The Home Rule Bill was passed through Parliament, but was suspended until such time as the war with Germany was won. Surprisingly, the war was greeted with much enthusiasm by the Irish, who volunteered to fight for the king in their thousands. Altogether, between 150 and 200,000 men enlisted. The Irish soldiers fought bravely, and a quarter of all enlisted Irishmen died during the war. This high casualty rate, as well as the blatant discrimination meted upon the Irish by the British officers, led first to a loss of enthusiasm toward the war, and then to a rise in revolutionary sentiment. Weapons were smuggled into Ireland from Germany in preparation for a mass uprising. The 1916 uprising was planned to be nationwide in scope, but a series of mishaps led to it being confined to Dublin alone. The British had learned of the planned uprising and on April 21st arrested Irish nationalist Roger Casement in County Kerry for smuggling weapons to the rebels. After this, the national rising was delayed, but on April 24th, Irish volunteers seized the Dublin General Post Office, and nationalist leader and schoolteacher Patrick Pearse read aloud a proclamation announcing the birth of an Irish Republic. British troops soon arrived in Dublin, leading to a week of street fighting. British artillery compelled Pearse and his colleagues to surrender on April 29th. Pearse and 14 other leaders of the rebellion were executed by British authorities in the weeks that followed. Though the uprising itself had been unpopular by most of the Irish people, these executions inspired a wave of hatred against the British and turned the dead leaders into martyrs. The Easter Rising thus signalled the start of the Republican Revolution in Ireland and would directly lead to the War of Independence that would follow the First World War. The Netherlands was neutral in World War I, but was forced to mobilise its army as both the Allies and Germany attempted to bully the country into joining their side. A fierce blockade was imposed by the Royal Navy on German goods moving through the country to prevent them from reaching Germany. This led to food shortages and mass riots in Amsterdam, where food intended for export to England was seized and eaten by the locals. Spies swarmed into the country from all sides and attempted to recruit the Dutch to their cause. By far the most famous Dutch spy was Margaretha Zeller, a former exotic dancer better known by her Indonesian stage name Mata Hari. Hari frequently travelled across national borders and in 1916 was recruited by French intelligence. In 1917 she was then accused of betraying the French and working with the Germans, an accusation for which there was little direct evidence. The French, however, needed a scapegoat for their failures in the 1917 spring offensive and shot Matahari by firing squad in October. Italy originally pursued a policy of sacred egotism in the war, playing both sides off against each other while staying neutral. The Allies promised the Italians extensive lands in Tyrol and the Balkans in return for an alliance, and Italy promptly attacked Austria-Hungary in May 1915. The war was opposed by most Italians. It was supported only by the conservative government, nationalists and radical socialists who thought that it would result in the overthrow of capitalism. This latter group included the socialist journalist Benito Mussolini. The demonstrations in favor of the war by ultra-nationalists and cultural futurists, the precursors to cultural fascists, were known in Italy as the Radiant Days of May. Italy's war effort was poorly managed, resulting in a horrible experience for Italian soldiers, who were mostly peasants from southern Italy, as they were thrown at fortified Austrian positions in the mountains over and over again. Not only were Italian soldiers worse paid and worsely equipped than their British and French counterparts, they were, at first, not even allowed short breaks from the front lines to recuperate, being forced to man the trenches on all occasions. Italian morale reached such a low ebb that an Austro-German offensive smashed through Italian lines in 1917 at the Battle of Caporetto, and could have reached Venice had not the starving Austrian soldiers stopped along the way to pillage ample Italian warehouses and wineries. After Caporetto, the Italian government rallied the country, made welfare concessions to the troops, and fought a more defensive campaign until October 1918, when, in the closing stages of the war, the Italians won a decisive victory at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. Yet Italy emerged a scarred and bitterly divided country, and the Italian flag had become a symbol of hatred for northern workers and southern farmers alike. Serbia had already fought 2 wars just before the First World War, and as a result its army was well drilled and experienced. Moreover, Serbs were ideologically committed both to defending their country from Austrian advances and expanding Greater Serbia through the acquisition of Bosnia. As a result, Austrian attacks in August and November 1914 were unable to break through the Serbian front line, and embarrassingly the Austrians were forced to retreat. In the winter of 1914-15, however, a terrible epidemic of typhus struck Serbia, devastating both the civilian population and the army. When the Germans opened a third offensive with the assistance of Bulgaria in October 1915, the weakened Serbs were unable to sustain a defense on 2 fronts and were forced to retreat across Albania to the Adriatic coast. Devastated more by the ravages of winter in the mountains than by Albanian attacks, the remnants of the Serbian army were transferred by French ships to the safety of Corfu, a Greek island in the Ionian Sea. In July 1917, the Serbian government in Corfu signed the Corfu Declaration, which called for a single democratic South Slav state to be made up of Serbians, Croatians, and Slovenians. Bulgaria joined the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, hoping to make up for some of the losses it incurred in the Second Balkan War. The country's experience in the First World War, despite successful offensives against Serbia and Romania, was miserable. By the autumn of 1918, nearly 40% of the male population had been conscripted. Of the army of 900,000 men, the Bulgarians suffered 100,000 killed, the most severe per capita loss of any country. Bad weather and the absence of adult male labor cut grain production nearly in half, whilst those in the towns suffered from shortages of food and fuel and from runaway inflation. On September 15, 1918, the Allies, including Serbians, that had been sitting in Salonika for 2 years, finally broke through the Bulgarian lines, aided by fighter aircraft, which strafed the retreating Bulgarian forces with machine guns. The army dissolved, and rebellious troops proclaimed Bulgaria to be a republic. The Bulgarian government asked the Allies for an armistice, which was signed on September 29th. 4 days later, Tsar Ferdinand abdicated in favour of his son Boris and left the country. The failed British attempt to storm the Gallipoli Peninsula and force open the Dardanelles Straits is well known. Coincidentally, this is where my own great-grandfather fought in the First World War. Less known are the British campaigns against the Ottomans in the south. In 1915, the Ottoman army launched an offensive to capture the Suez Canal. This so-called raid failed to capture the canal due to poor supply lines in the area, something that also prevented an effective British response. The British built up their army in Egypt, mostly with Indian troops, and prepared for an offensive into Palestine. Meanwhile, the British entered Basra in today's Iraq. In a campaign aimed at taking Baghdad, in which the army was also mostly Indian, the British suffered a defeat at Kut al-Amara in April 1916, but finally managed to take Baghdad on March 11th, 1917. The Iraq campaign was brutal, with both Indians and the Turkish army being beset by disease caught from mosquitoes in the swampy terrain. The British made their breakthrough in Palestine in 1917. The British Egypt Expedition Force, made up of Brits, Australians, New Zealanders, and Indians, had been unable to break through Ottoman lines in Gaza in 2 battles earlier in the year. On October 31st, however, the EEF launched a successful offensive, with the majority of the forces pinning the Ottoman army down in a frontal assault. Australian light cavalry then conducted a rapid offensive to take the town of Beersheba, cutting the Ottoman supply lines and causing Ottoman forces to rapidly retreat. Jerusalem was captured 6 weeks later, in what Prime Minister Lloyd George called a Christmas present for the British people. The victory was a morale boost for the British, distracting them from the brutal and bloody failures in France and Belgium. Palestine would remain under British occupation for 30 years. War soon spread to the Islamic holy cities. The ruler of Mecca, Sharif Hussein, with assurance of British support, revolted against the Ottomans in June 1916, taking Mecca but failing to take Medina. In Yemen, Ottoman forces entered the British protectorate, but the war subsequently settled down to a stalemate. Hussein's 2 sons, who had declared Hussein, who had declared himself king of all Arabs, directed 2 of his sons, Faisal and Abdullah, to stir up the Arab tribes against the Ottomans, and, assisted by British suppliers and officers, including the famous Lawrence of Arabia, the Arabian forces moved north into Transjordan along the right flank of the British army. Together, the British and the Arabians, who had been promised their own state in event of victory, captured Damascus in 1918. Faisal then set up an Arab government, only to be dislodged by the French in 1920, who had secretly divided up the region with the British. In 1921 he was made king of Iraq, whilst his brother Abdullah became emir of Jordan. Both rulers were puppets of the British. Meanwhile, during the war, relations between Sharif Hussein and Ibn Saud, ruler of the centre of the Arabian Peninsula, worsened. In 1919, this dispute broke into an open clash. Saud's forces, the Wahhabis, won so decisive a victory that they might have advanced unopposed into Mecca, but then the British stopped the attack. However, the Sharif then refused the terms of a treaty with Britain, mainly because of the Balfour Declaration, which approved a national home in Palestine for the Jewish people. The Wahhabis subsequently marched into Mecca in 1924, and by October Hussein was deposed as ruler. Multicultural Brazil, with many German citizens, originally stayed neutral in the war. However, German attacks upon Brazilian shipping, part of the tactic to starve the UK into surrendering, caused outrage and riots in the cities of the country. Brazil declared war in October 1917, and the government found itself faced with counter-demonstrations by pacifists and workers. Brazilian soldiers arrived in time to participate in the successful autumn offensives in 1918, during which many Brazilians were awarded medals for heroism. Some Brazilian nationalists made contrasts with the performance of their former Portuguese rulers who fought poorly and suffered greatly in both France and Africa. Brazil would emerge from the war with a newfound sense of confidence, whilst Portugal would continue its decline and political instability. Lastly, both Japan and China played active roles in the First World War. The Japanese forces greatly expanded their country's colonial empire by taking German possessions in the Pacific, as well as the port city of Tsingtao on the Chinese mainland, which had been in German hands since 1898. When China subsequently sought the return of the former German holdings, Japan responded with the 21 demands issued in 1915 that tried to pressure China into widespread concessions. Whilst giving in on a number of specific issues, the Chinese resisted the most extreme Japanese demands that would have turned China into a Japanese client state. Chinese citizens, meanwhile, played a very important role on every front as carriers of supplies and as medical assistants. Their extensive role was at first downplayed by West Europeans and then forgotten entirely. Japan's openly expansionist policies, meanwhile, left behind a legacy of ill feeling and distrust in both China, Europe, and the US. General Chinese outrage over their treatment at the Versailles Conference, at which they received none of their occupied cities back from the Europeans and the Japanese, led to mass protests and increased nationalism throughout the country in the so-called May the 4th movement.